This is the third video of Chapter 7. It corresponds to Section 7.3 in your Anatomy and Physiology textbook. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the two mechanisms by which bone is formed, and also talk about how mature bone remodels itself and continues to grow and maintain its structure and healthiness. So we have two terms here. They're synonyms. They mean the same thing, ossification and osteogenesis. So both of those terms mean the formation of bone. In infants and fetuses, we have two mechanisms that bone develops by. Okay? So we have intramembranous ossification, and we have endochondrial ossification. Okay, so we have two different mechanisms here. Okay, so intramembranous ossification. The first thing that happens is the osteoid tissue is deposited into the embryonic mesenchyme. Okay, so the osteoblasts are here, and in the blue around it we have the osteoid tissue, and this is going to be the beginning of bone formation. Okay, our second step, calcification of osteoid tissue and entrapment of osteocytes. Okay, so we have the calcification going on. These things are getting more rigid, more locked in place. And the osteocytes, remember we talked about those in the last video, the osteocytes are getting trapped in the matrix. Okay, our third step, the spongy bone forms kind of a honeycomb pattern with the developing periosteum. And finally, the compact bone is found at the edges, the margins of the bone, and the spongy bone remains in the middle. Okay, so this is a micrograph showing the process that we just saw in cartoon. We can see the osteocytes and the osteoblasts and the different layers of tissue there. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the other type of ossification. The other type of ossification is called endochondral ossification. And with this, we use cartilage as a template, and the bone is built from that cartilage template. So here we have the early cartilage model, that hyaline cartilage. If you need to review the properties of hyaline cartilage, please do that before the exam. Then we have something called a primary ossification center form that kind of forms in the middle. And that's going to be the site from which the bone hardening, the process takes place. Okay, into what becomes the primary marrow cavity, we have blood vessels come in. That's vasculature invasion, the introduction of blood vessels. And when this happens, we have a secondary ossification center away from the middle that forms. Okay, so these first three steps, these all happen in the fetus. And then from here on out, these are things that happen right around the time that the child is born. Okay, so at birth, the marrow cavity is bigger than it will be at any other time in the individual's life. It takes up more of the empty space. I want to point out here we have the epiphyseal plate, the growth plate. This is where new tissue is going to be deposited. And then in the adult, once the bone is mature, the epiphyseal plate is closed. We can see the epiphyseal line afterwards. We still have the marrow cavity, but it's not nearly as large a component as it was in the children. During infancy and childhood, the epiphyses, they fill with that spongy bone tissue. So the cartilage at that epiphyseal plate, or that growth plate, is very thin, and it separates the primary and secondary marrow cavities. The epiphyseal plates are there all through childhood and all through adolescence. And this is where long bones elongate from. This is also why if bones get broken close to that epiphyseal plate, we have to do extra measures, sometimes surgery or screws in plates to preserve that epiphyseal plate so that the bones continue to grow. By a person's early 20s, the epiphyseal plate is closed, we say. All that cartilage has been consumed, and the primary and secondary marrow cavities that were separated by the epiphyseal plate are now conjoined into one cavity. And at this point, bone cannot grow any more in length. And this is why after your early 20s, people don't grow any taller. This ossification process continues throughout a person's whole life. And bones can grow in two directions. They can grow longer, they can grow wider. I like this picture here. It shows epiphyseal plates very clearly. Okay, so we see the epiphyseal plate here between the epiphysis and the metacarpal, that long bone in your hand, and here at the base of the thumb, and here in the wrist as well. So again, that epiphyseal plate is the place where cartilage is transitioning to bone. It's the zone where the bone can grow longer. It's made of hyali cartilage and has bone on either side of it, and then that hyali cartilage is eventually replaced with bone as well. This is a type of what we call interstitial growth. The bone doesn't get longer at the very ends. The bone gets longer at the plate that is close to an end, but not at an end, and that pushes the ends of the bone out. So we call the transition from cartilage to bone metaphysis, and there are 5 distinct phases of metaphysis, starting with hyali cartilage and all the way to bone deposition. Two diseases that are related to bone growth are achondroplastic dwarfism, and this is when a person has a normal-sized torso but short limbs. And in this case, we have a defect in metaphysis, a defect in that cartilage growth. And the long bones stop growing much earlier than they would in a typical human being. So this is a genetic disorder. It happens by a dominant allele. So one copy of this trait and a person will have achondroplastic dwarfism. The other type of dwarfism is called pituitary dwarfism. We call it pituitary dwarfism because it's caused by a lack of growth hormone, and growth hormone is synthesized by the pituitary gland. When somebody has pituitary dwarfism, they look like a miniature person. Their proportions are normal. They don't have short limbs compared to their torso. So that's how we would distinguish between the two types of dwarfism. So I'm sure you guys have seen individuals with achondroplastic dwarfism. Their torso is normal size, but their limbs are significantly shorter. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how bones grow and remodel themselves after a person is done growing, after their early 20s. So we continually have bones that are changing their diameter and thickness. we have the osteoblasts on the inner periosteum, and they deposit osteoid tissue that becomes trapped in the matrix and calcifies. And this is the mechanism that our bones remodel. About 10% of your skeleton is remodeled per year. And this remodeling happens because the skeleton accumulates microfractures, small damage that a lot of the time we don't even notice has happened. This happens when our body needs to release calcium or phosphorus or magnesium from the bones into the blood to maintain homeostasis. It also happens when bones are reshaped from use and disuse.